the steaming delta lowlands of northern Vietnam in the final weeks of 1946. A war began that would not end for nearly 8 years, and that would set in motion a chain of consequences reaching across 3 decades of continuous conflict in Southeast Asia. The French soldiers who patrolled the streets of Hanoi that December believed they were restoring order to a colonial possession that had briefly slipped from their grasp during the chaos of Japanese occupation and the nationalist uprising that followed. The Vietnamese fighters who faced them across barricades made of furniture, sandbags, and the rubble of bombed buildings believed something entirely different. They believed they were fighting the first battle of a revolution that would end foreign rule over their land permanently, and that no army, however well equipped and however determined, could ultimately prevent. Both sides were absolutely certain of their position. Both sides were prepared to pay any price to prevail, and in that collision of absolute certainties, one of the most consequential armed conflicts of the 20th century was born. The First Indochina War is not as well remembered in the Western world as the American conflict that followed it, and the relative obscurity is historically unjust because the First War contained within it the seeds of everything that came after. The decisions made in Paris and Hanoi and the mountains of the Vietnamese interior between 1946 and 1954 shaped the strategic landscape that American policymakers inherited when they began their own intervention, and the lessons that the French experience offered about the limits of conventional military power against a determined guerrilla movement with genuine popular support were lessons that the Americans would eventually be forced to learn again at far greater cost. Understanding the First Indochina War is not simply an exercise in historical recovery. It is essential context for understanding how the world's most powerful military nation came to suffer its most consequential military defeat in a country whose entire territory was smaller than the state of California. The story of how France came to control Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos as the colonial territory it called Indochina begins in the middle decades of the 19th century, when the European powers were extending their imperial reach across Asia and Africa with a speed and a confidence that reflected both the military advantages that industrialization had given them and the ideological framework of racial and civilizational hierarchy that made conquest feel like mission rather than theft. France had been watching British expansion in Asia with a combination of admiration and competitive anxiety, and the establishment of French control over the southern Vietnamese territories that became the colony of Cochinchina in 1862 was driven as much by the desire not to be left behind in the imperial competition with Britain as by any specific assessment of what Vietnam's economic or strategic value actually was. The Vietnamese imperial court at Hue, which had governed the country under the Nguyen dynasty since the early 19th century, was not without the capacity to resist French encroachment, but it faced a combination of internal divisions, technological disadvantage, and the particular vulnerability of a court culture that prized Confucian scholarship and administrative elegance over the military innovation that confronting European firepower required. The French gunboats that ascended the Mekong and the Red River carried weapons that Vietnamese defenders could not match with the resources available to them, and the sequential loss of Cochinchina in the south, Annam and Tonkin in the center and north, Cambodia, and eventually Laos to French control between 1862 and 1907 followed a pattern of gradual encroachment in which each territorial gain provided the base for the next advance. The French colonial project in Indochina was justified to the French public and to the international community through the civilizing mission ideology that provided the moral vocabulary of 19th century European imperialism. The Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian peoples were to be elevated through exposure to French civilization, French language, French law, and French economic organization from their supposed state of backwardness to a higher level of development that French tutelage would make possible. The ideology was self-serving in its most obvious dimension, providing moral cover for an enterprise whose primary motivations were economic exploitation and geopolitical competition. But it also reflected genuine convictions held by at least some of the colonial administrators and missionaries who implemented it. Convictions about the universal applicability of French cultural values that the French Republican tradition had always been particularly prone to generating. The economic reality of French colonial rule in Indochina bore little resemblance to the civilizing mission rhetoric that justified it. The colonial economy was organized primarily to extract value from Vietnam's agricultural and mineral resources for the benefit of French commercial interests and the French state, with the welfare of the Vietnamese population treated as a secondary consideration at best and an irrelevant one at worst. The rubber plantations that French companies developed in the southern and central highland regions of Vietnam became the most visible symbol of colonial economic exploitation. Their profitability depended on a labor system that combined legal coercion, debt bondage, and physical violence to extract maximum productivity from Vietnamese workers at minimum cost. The plantation system and the associated infrastructure of roads, railways, and port facilities that the colonial administration built to move rubber, rice, coal, and other commodities to export markets required enormous quantities of Vietnamese labor, and the recruitment of that labor through a system of taxation and corvée obligation that left Vietnamese peasants little practical choice about whether to work for French enterprises created the conditions of resentment and resistance that nationalist movements would eventually organize and direct against colonial authority. The Vietnamese peasants who left their villages to work on the rubber plantations of Michelin and other French companies did not return from that experience as grateful beneficiaries of French civilization. They returned when they survived the conditions that killed significant proportions of plantation workers as men and women who understood viscerally and personally what colonial rule actually meant for those at the bottom of its hierarchy. The educational system that French colonial administration developed in Indochina was designed to produce the Vietnamese clerical and administrative workforce that the colonial bureaucracy required, not to create the educated class that might eventually challenge French authority. The small number of Vietnamese who gained access to French language higher education, either in Indochina or in France itself, absorbed not only the technical knowledge and the administrative skills that colonial education offered, but also the political ideas of liberty, equality, and national self-determination that French Republican culture contained alongside its imperial practice. The contradiction between French Republican ideals and French imperial reality was not lost on the Vietnamese students who encountered both simultaneously, and the experience of that contradiction was one of the most powerful generators of the nationalist consciousness that would eventually challenge colonial rule. Ho Chi Minh was the figure who most completely embodied this trajectory from colonial subject to revolutionary leader, and his personal history contained within it the essential dynamics of the Vietnamese nationalist movement that he would eventually lead to victory. Born Nguyen Yen Sinh Cung in 1890 in Anh Province, a region of central Vietnam with a long history of resistance to outside authority, he grew up in a family whose Confucian scholarly tradition gave him both an education and a social position that the French colonial system's expansion was steadily undermining. His father, a minor official who had refused to learn French, represented the generation of Vietnamese who responded to colonial rule with dignified resistance rather than accommodation. And the example shaped his son's political consciousness in ways that formal education only reinforced. He left Vietnam in 1911, working as a cook's assistant on a French ocean liner, and spent the following decade traveling through Asia, Africa, Europe, and the United States, observing the workings of colonial and capitalist systems from the perspective of a young Vietnamese man who had no illusions about what those systems meant for the people at their margins. He arrived in Paris during the First World War and was present at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, where he attempted to present Woodrow Wilson's delegation with a petition requesting Vietnamese self-determination under the 14 points principles that the American president had proclaimed as the basis for the post-war order. The petition was ignored. The experience of being ignored by the liberal international order at its most self-congratulatory moment was formative, driving him toward the Marxist-Leninist framework that the newly formed Communist International was offering as an alternative theory of anti-colonial revolution. He became a founding member of the French Communist Party in 1920 and traveled to Moscow for training in revolutionary organization before moving to China, where the presence of Vietnamese exile communities and the proximity to the Vietnamese border made it possible to build the organizational infrastructure that a revolutionary movement required. He founded the Revolutionary Youth League of Vietnam in 1925, the precursor organization to the Indo-Chinese Communist Party that he established in 1930 in Hong Kong, creating the disciplined organizational framework that would eventually coordinate the resistance against French colonial rule and then against Japanese occupation, and then against the French again in the war that began in 1946. The Japanese occupation of Indochina between 1940 and 1945 fundamentally transformed the political landscape that the First Indochina War would be fought over, because it demonstrated with unmistakable clarity that French colonial authority was not the natural order of things, but a contingent arrangement that could be swept away by a superior military force. When Japan demanded and received French collaboration in the use of Indochina as a military base in 1940, exploiting the weakness of the metropolitan France that had just been defeated by Germany, the prestige of French colonial authority suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered in Vietnamese eyes. The French colonial administration that continued to function under Japanese supervision was revealed as a structure maintained at Japanese sufferance rather than through any inherent French capacity to impose order on the territory it claimed to govern. The Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam that Ho Chi Minh established in 1941 as a broad nationalist front organization under communist leadership, built its political and military organization during the years of Japanese occupation with a strategic clarity and an organizational discipline that reflected both Ho's decades of revolutionary preparation and the specific opportunities that the occupation's disruption of colonial authority created. Operating from bases in the northern mountains near the Chinese border, the Viet Minh built village-level political organizations, recruited and trained military cadres, and developed the mass mobilization techniques that Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party had demonstrated in the Chinese countryside, adapting them to Vietnamese conditions with a sensitivity to local culture and political dynamics that made them genuinely effective rather than merely imitative. The Japanese decision in March 1945 to disarm and imprison the French colonial forces that had been collaborating with them, responding to the growing likelihood of Allied victory and the possibility that the French forces might turn against them, created a brief window of genuine political vacuum in Vietnam that the Viet Minh moved to fill with remarkable speed and effectiveness. The August Revolution of 1945, in which Viet Minh forces occupied Hanoi, Hue, and other major Vietnamese cities in the days following Japan's surrender and before Allied forces could restore colonial authority, demonstrated the organizational capacity that Ho's movement had built during the occupation years and created the political facts on the ground that subsequent diplomacy would have to address. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi before a crowd of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese citizens and proclaimed the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, deliberately echoing the American Declaration of Independence in the opening words of his proclamation. The choice of text was not accidental. Ho was appealing to the United States as a power whose anti-colonial revolutionary tradition and whose wartime rhetoric of self-determination might make it a potential ally against French reimposition of colonial authority. The appeal was ultimately unsuccessful, as American Cold War priorities pushed the Truman administration towards supporting French authority in Indochina, rather than Vietnamese independence. But the moment of the proclamation captured with perfect clarity what the Viet Minh were claiming, and what the French would have to destroy if they intended to restore colonial rule. The French return to Indochina in the months following the Japanese surrender was facilitated by British forces in the south, where British Indian troops accepted the Japanese surrender and then helped restore French authority in Cochinchina in circumstances that required the rearming of Japanese soldiers to maintain order against Viet Minh resistance, one of the more revealing ironies of the post-war decolonization process. In the north, Chinese nationalist forces occupied the country above the 16th parallel as the designated recipients of the Japanese surrender in that zone, and their presence temporarily prevented the immediate restoration of French authority, while creating the conditions for the negotiations between the French government and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam that briefly held open the possibility of a political rather than a military resolution. The negotiations between France and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam that took place through the first half of 1946 represented the last serious opportunity to avoid the war that both sides claimed not to want, and that both sides were simultaneously preparing for with a thoroughness that suggested their stated preference for peace was considerably more qualified than their public positions acknowledged. The preliminary agreement of March 6, 1946, signed between Ho Chi Minh and the French representative Jean Saint-Denis, appeared on its surface to offer a genuine framework for political resolution, with France recognizing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state within the French Union and agreeing to a referendum that would determine whether the southern colony of Cochinchina would reunify with the north and center under Vietnamese governance. Ho Chi Minh accepted terms that his more militantly nationalist colleagues regarded as insufficient, because he calculated that a period of peaceful consolidation would give the Viet Minh the time and the organizational space to build the military and administrative capacity that a future confrontation with France would require. The French government's simultaneous pursuit of negotiation and military positioning reflected the fundamental ambivalence about decolonization that characterized French political culture in the immediate post-war period. The politicians and officials who negotiated with Ho Chi Minh in good faith were operating within a political system that also contained powerful forces committed to the restoration of the French Empire, as an essential component of French national greatness and French recovery from the humiliation of wartime defeat and occupation. The colonial lobby, the military officers whose careers and identities were bound up in the maintenance of French imperial authority, and the economic interests that had built profitable enterprises in Indochina all exercised influence on French policy that consistently pulled against the accommodations that genuine negotiation required. The Fontainebleau Conference that convened in the summer of 1946 brought Ho Chi Minh to France for 2 months of negotiations that ultimately produced nothing of substance, because the French delegation was not empowered to make the concessions on Cochinchina's status and Vietnamese sovereignty that would have given the negotiations genuine content. While Ho Chi Minh sat in conference rooms in Paris trying to negotiate a political settlement, French authorities in Saigon were proclaiming the Autonomous Republic of Cochinchina in June 1946, a unilateral action that directly contradicted the March Agreement's provision for a referendum on reunification and that demonstrated with unmistakable clarity the limits of French willingness to implement the political commitments its negotiators had made. Ho Chi Minh left France in September 1946, having signed a modus vivendi agreement that both sides recognized as a temporary measure rather than a genuine resolution. And the months that followed were a period of accelerating tension in which incidents of violence between French forces and Viet Minh units multiplied across the country, with a frequency and a seriousness that made the descent into full-scale war feel less like a choice than an inevitability. The specific incident that transformed the accumulated tensions into open war occurred in Haiphong in November 1946, when a dispute over customs control of the port city escalated through a series of confrontations between French and Vietnamese forces into a French naval bombardment of the Vietnamese quarters of the city that killed an estimated 6,000 civilians in a single afternoon. The bombardment was ordered by the French commander Colonel Debs in response to orders from Saigon that reflected the growing dominance of the military hardliners over the more cautious political voices in French Indochina policy. And it represented the kind of disproportionate escalation that colonial military cultures routinely employed against subject populations, but that in the specific political circumstances of post-war Indochina served to burn away whatever remaining basis for negotiated settlement the previous months of diplomatic effort had created. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the military commander of the Viet Minh forces and the man whose strategic genius would eventually devise the tactics that defeated the French, ordered the nationwide military offensive that began on the night of December 19, 1946, with coordinated attacks on French positions across Hanoi and other northern Vietnamese cities. The offensive was not expected to defeat the French militarily in any immediate sense. Giap understood that the Viet Minh lacked the conventional military capability to confront French forces in the open field engagements that French training and equipment were designed for, and that the appropriate strategic response was to force the French into a prolonged guerrilla conflict in which the political costs of maintaining military commitment would eventually outweigh the benefits of holding territory that France's colonial ideology required it to defend. Vo Nguyen Giap was born in 1911 in Quang Binh Province, a region of central Vietnam whose poverty and its history of resistance to outside authority shaped his political consciousness from childhood. He studied law at the University of Hanoi, where he became involved in nationalist politics, and then taught history at a private school in Hanoi while continuing his political activities. His wife was arrested by the French security services in 1941 and died in prison, a personal loss that reinforced the political convictions he had already developed and that gave his commitment to the revolution an emotional intensity that went beyond ideological calculation. He had no formal military training when Ho Chi Minh assigned him the task of building the Viet Minh's armed forces, but he compensated for this deficit through an extraordinary capacity for self-education, studying the campaigns of Napoleon, the Chinese communist military doctrine that Mao had developed, and the specific geographic and political conditions of Vietnam with a thoroughness that eventually made him one of the most formidable military strategists of the 20th century. His strategic framework for the war against France was drawn from the Maoist concept of people's war, adapted to Vietnamese conditions with modifications that reflected both Giap's independent military thinking and the specific characteristics of the French colonial system he was fighting. The three-phase model of revolutionary warfare, beginning with the defensive phase of building political and military organization in liberated base areas, progressing through the equilibrium phase of guerrilla operations that gradually exhausted the enemy's resources and will, and culminating in the general offensive that would deliver the decisive military blow, provided the overall strategic architecture within which the Viet Minh's specific tactical choices were made. The framework required patience of a kind that conventional military thinking found difficult to sustain, because success was measured not in territory captured or enemy forces destroyed, but in the gradual erosion of the political will that sustained the French commitment to the war. The French military response to the Viet Minh offensive drew on the institutional traditions and the strategic assumptions of a professional army, whose experience had been formed in the very different conditions of European warfare and colonial pacification campaigns against less organized opponents. The French expeditionary corps that fought in Indochina included veterans of the Second World War, Foreign Legion units with their own distinctive culture and their own understanding of what military service required. North African colonial troops whose presence in an Asian counterinsurgency campaign reflected the interconnected structure of the French imperial military system, and career officers whose professional advancement depended on demonstrating results in a conflict that the ambiguity of guerrilla warfare made genuinely difficult to measure in conventional military terms. The initial French military response to the Viet Minh offensive was to occupy the major urban centers and the transportation infrastructure that connected them, establishing a network of fortified positions and supply routes that gave French forces control of the physical terrain that economic and administrative activity required, while conceding the rural areas and the mountains to Viet Minh organization and movement. This approach reflected both the realistic limits of the forces available for the pacification effort and the strategic assumption that controlling the cities and the main roads was equivalent to controlling the country, an assumption that the nature of the conflict the French were actually engaged in made fundamentally incorrect. The Viet Minh used the rural areas that French forces did not control as the organizational base for precisely the political and military development that Giap's strategic framework required. Village political committees collected taxes, administered justice, organized militia units, and maintained the communication networks that connected local Viet Minh organizations to the regional and national command structure. Military units trained in the mountains and the forests, gradually developing from the lightly armed guerrilla bands of the war's early phase into more conventionally organized infantry units capable of attacking French positions with coordinated tactics and sustaining the casualties that conventional combat produced. The transformation was gradual and uneven, moving faster in the northern regions where Chinese communist support became available after Mao's victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 than in the south, where French control was more established and Viet Minh organization was more fragmented. The Chinese Communist victory in October 1949 was the most significant external event of the First Indochina War's middle phase, because it transformed the strategic situation by giving the Viet Minh access to a secure rear area across the northern border, a source of military equipment and supplies, and the organizational and technical assistance of advisors whose experience of the Chinese Communist military campaigns provided directly relevant expertise for the kind of conflict the Viet Minh were fighting. Chinese military aid began flowing to the Viet Minh in 1950, providing artillery, machine guns, and other heavy weapons that the guerrilla forces had previously lacked. And Chinese military advisors worked with Giap's commanders to develop the tactical capabilities for the large unit operations that the war's next phase would require. The French response to the changed strategic situation was to seek American support, framing the conflict in the ideological language of Cold War anti-communism that Washington found compelling and that transformed what the French military and political establishment understood primarily as a colonial war of reconquest into a theater of the global struggle against communist expansion that American strategic interests required them to support. The argument was not entirely cynical, because the Viet Minh were genuinely communist-led, and the Chinese support they were receiving was genuinely part of the broader pattern of Chinese communist engagement with revolutionary movements across Asia. But the framing also obscured the colonial dimensions of the conflict that made French authority in Indochina fundamentally untenable regardless of the Cold War context. And American policymakers who accepted the anti-communist framing without sufficient attention to the colonial reality were making the analytical error that would shape American Indochina policy with such disastrous consequences through the following 2 decades. American financial and military assistance to France began in 1950 and grew through the following years to the point where the United States was financing approximately 80% of the French war effort by the conflict's final phase. The assistance reflected the Truman administration's acceptance of the domino theory logic that the fall of Indochina to communist control would trigger a cascade of communist victories across Southeast Asia, a strategic assessment whose geographical and political assumptions were more confident than the evidence supported, but that carried enormous weight in the post-China, post-Korea political environment of the early 1950s. The price of American support was the acceleration of the nominal decolonization process through which France established the associated states of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos as formally independent entities within the French Union. A political arrangement designed to distinguish the French position from straightforward colonial rule without actually transferring the sovereignty that genuine independence required. The Battle of Route Colonial 4 in the autumn of 1950 demonstrated that the changed strategic situation had fundamentally altered the military balance in ways that French commanders were not yet prepared to acknowledge. Giap used the Chinese-supplied artillery and his newly trained regular infantry units to attack and destroy a series of French fortified posts along the colonial road connecting Caobang to Lang Son near the Chinese border, inflicting casualties that represented the worst French military defeat since the fall of France in 1940, and forcing a hasty French withdrawal that turned into a rout as successive relief columns were ambushed and destroyed in the mountain passes. The battle killed or captured more than 6,000 French soldiers, destroyed a substantial portion of the French Expeditionary Corps' heavy equipment, and exposed the vulnerability of the fortified post strategy that had been the foundation of French military operations in the Northern Highlands. The French response to the catastrophe of Route Colonial 4 was to appoint General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny as both High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief in Indochina, giving a single commander the combined political and military authority that the conflict's nature required, and providing a figure of sufficient personal prestige and professional ability to attempt the fundamental restructuring of French strategy that the military situation demanded. De Lattre was one of France's most celebrated soldiers, a man of extraordinary personal charisma and genuine military talent whose arrival in Indochina in December 1950 transformed the morale of the French forces and the political atmosphere in Saigon with the force of a personality that demanded and usually received the best from everyone around him. He constructed the De Lattre Line, a network of fortified blockhouses and strong points around the Red River Delta that was designed to protect the densely populated and economically productive lowland core of northern Vietnam from Viet Minh penetration. And he launched a series of aggressive operations intended to force Giap's regular units into the kind of conventional battles where French firepower and tactical air support could inflict the casualties that would degrade Viet Minh military capacity. The battles of Vinh Yen in January 1951 and Dong Tru in March 1951 produced exactly the large unit confrontations that De Lattre wanted, and the French use of napalm and artillery against Viet Minh infantry formations attacking across open ground inflicted casualties on Giap's regular units that were severe enough to force a temporary strategic withdrawal and a reassessment of whether the time for the general offensive phase had genuinely arrived. Giap's willingness to accept these costly conventional battles reflected a calculation about the political sustainability of French commitment to the war that proved more accurate in the long run than in the immediate aftermath of the defeats. He understood that the political will to sustain the French war effort was more fragile than the military capacity that French forces were demonstrating in the field, and that even costly Viet Minh defeats served the strategic purpose of demonstrating to the French public and the French political class that the war could not be won quickly or cheaply enough to be worth continuing. The arithmetic of a war of attrition favored the side with the greater political will to sustain losses, and Giap was confident that Vietnamese willingness to absorb casualties in pursuit of independence exceeded French willingness to absorb casualties in pursuit of colonial restoration. De Lattre died of cancer in January 1952, his health destroyed by the combined demands of the military command and the personal grief of losing his son Bernard. Killed in action in the Dien Bien operation in May 1951 in circumstances that the father had been powerless to prevent despite his position as supreme commander. His death removed the one French commander who had demonstrated the ability to impose strategic coherence on the French war effort and to sustain the political will in France and in Washington that continued American support required. His successors, Generals Salin and Navarre, inherited a military situation that had temporarily stabilized, but that contained no path to the decisive French victory that the political sustainability of the war effort required. The year 1953 arrived in Indochina with a quiet that both sides recognized as deceptive. French forces held the delta, Viet Minh units held the mountains. Neither side had broken the other, but the balance was shifting in ways that French commanders could feel without fully articulating. The Viet Minh were growing stronger every month. Chinese weapons were crossing the border in increasing quantities. Vietnamese recruits were filling Giap's expanding regular army with a speed that French intelligence tracked but could not stop. The war had settled into a grinding pattern that favored the side with greater patience, and patience was something the French political system was rapidly running out of. General Henry Navarre arrived in Indochina in May 1953 with a mandate to find a way out. He was a career intelligence officer rather than a combat commander. He was methodical, careful, and deeply uncomfortable with the ambiguity that counterinsurgency warfare produced. He studied the situation with the analytical rigor of his professional background and concluded that the French position required a dramatic shift. He needed a military victory large enough to change the political calculus in Paris and Washington. He needed something that would demonstrate French strength rather than merely contain French weakness. He needed a battle on terms that French firepower could dominate. What he chose instead was Dien Bien Phu. The valley of Dien Bien Phu sat in the remote northwestern corner of Vietnam near the Laotian border. It was a wide, flat depression surrounded by heavily forested hills that rose steeply on every side. Navarre chose it for a specific strategic reason. He believed it could serve as a fortified base from which French mobile forces could interdict Viet Minh supply routes into Laos. He believed it could provoke Giap into a set-piece battle where French artillery and air power would destroy the Viet Minh's regular divisions. He believed the surrounding hills were too steep and too distant for Viet Minh artillery to threaten the base effectively. Every one of these beliefs proved catastrophically wrong. The French began constructing their fortified base at Dien Bien Phu in November 1953. Paratroopers dropped into the valley and began clearing the existing Viet Minh garrison. Engineers built an airstrip. Soldiers constructed a network of strong points across the valley floor, each one named after a woman: Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Huguette, Claudine, Eliane, Dominique, Isabelle. The names carried an almost deliberate lightness that contrasted with the desperate fighting that would eventually occur at each position. By early 1954, the garrison held approximately 13,000 soldiers of multiple nationalities, foreign legionnaires, Moroccan and Algerian troops, Vietnamese soldiers fighting under French command, and French metropolitan forces. Giap's response to the French occupation of Dien Bien Phu was one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in the history of guerrilla warfare. He moved for full infantry divisions into the hills surrounding the valley. He moved artillery, including heavy anti-aircraft guns and 105mm howitzers that French planners had deemed impossible to position in the surrounding terrain. He moved these weapons not on roads, because no roads existed in sufficient condition, but on the backs of tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians. who carried artillery pieces disassembled into components through mountain jungle paths over distances that conventional military logic said were impossible to traverse with heavy weapons. The human effort behind this logistical achievement deserves to be understood in its full dimensions. The supply lines that fed and armed the Viet Minh forces at Dien Bien Phu depended on a system of organized civilian labor that mobilized entire villages across the northwestern highlands. Men and women carried artillery shells in baskets on their backs, moving along jungle paths at night to avoid French air observation. Bicycles modified to carry enormous loads became one of the primary transport vehicles, a single modified bicycle capable of carrying several hundred kilograms of supplies when pushed by a skilled operator along the mountain trails. The organization of this supply system reflected both the Viet Minh's political penetration of the civilian population and GIAP's understanding that logistics, rather than tactics, would determine the battle's outcome. The French at Dien Bien Phu remained unaware of the true scale of what GIAP was assembling until it was too late to respond effectively. French aerial reconnaissance underestimated the number of Viet Minh troops moving toward the valley. French intelligence assessments consistently minimized the possibility that heavy artillery could be positioned in the surrounding hills. The commander at Dien Bien Phu, Colonel Christian de Castries, received optimistic assessments from Navarre's headquarters that bore little relationship to what his own patrols were beginning to discover about the strength and the positioning of the forces surrounding him. The gap between what French commanders believed and what was actually happening in the jungle-covered hills above the valley was the gap between confidence and catastrophe. GIAP's artillery opened fire on March 13, 1954. The effect was immediate and devastating. The French artillery commander, Colonel Charles Piroth, had publicly promised that his guns would silence any Viet Minh artillery within a few rounds of its revealing its position. When the Viet Minh guns fired from positions concealed in the hillsides and the French counter-battery fire proved unable to locate or destroy them, Piroth retreated to his bunker and killed himself with a grenade, leaving a note that expressed his conviction that he had dishonored France. His death on the battle's first day captured something essential about the French military psychology at Dien Bien Phu, a culture of professional pride and institutional confidence meeting a reality for which it had no adequate response. The strong point of Beatrice fell on the night of March 13th, its garrison of foreign legionnaires overwhelmed by a coordinated Viet Minh infantry assault that came in human waves across ground that French defensive fire could not stop in sufficient numbers. Gabriel fell 2 days later. Anne-Marie was abandoned as the Thai auxiliary units defending it melted away in the face of Viet Minh pressure. The fall of these outer strongpoints in the battle's first days fundamentally changed the strategic situation inside the valley. French aircraft could still land on the airstrip, but the Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns were making each landing and takeoff a dangerous gamble. The garrison's commander began requesting emergency reinforcements and additional supplies that the French air transport fleet struggled to deliver under conditions of constant anti-aircraft fire. The battle settled into a siege. French forces held the central positions around the command bunker and the airstrip. Viet Minh forces held the high ground and were systematically pushing their trench lines forward toward the French perimeter, digging through the valley floor with a patience and a thoroughness that recalled the siege warfare of earlier centuries while demonstrating a discipline and an organizational capacity that the French had consistently underestimated. Each night, Viet Minh engineers extended their trenches closer to the French positions. Each day, French soldiers tried to hold what remained of the perimeter, while aircraft attempted to deliver the supplies and reinforcements that kept the garrison alive. The French government in Paris was watching the battle with the growing horror of men who understood that a catastrophic defeat was approaching, but could find no mechanism to prevent it. Negotiations for a political settlement of the Indochina conflict had been agreed upon at the Berlin Conference in February 1954, with a major international conference scheduled to open in Geneva in April to address both the Korean and the Indochina situations. The timing could not have been worse from the French perspective. The garrison at Dien Bien Phu was fighting for its life at exactly the moment when the French negotiating position at Geneva depended on demonstrating sufficient military strength to extract acceptable terms from the Viet Minh and their Chinese and Soviet sponsors. The French government explored every possible mechanism for external military intervention that might relieve the garrison or change the battle's trajectory. The most serious of these explorations involved the United States. Admiral Arthur Radford, the chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, proposed a plan called Operation Vulture that would have used American carrier-based aircraft to conduct massive bombing raids against Viet Minh positions surrounding Dien Bien Phu. President Eisenhower was willing to consider the option, but conditioned American intervention on British participation and congressional approval, conditions that reflected his understanding that unilateral American military action in Indochina carried political risks that the fall of a single French garrison did not justify accepting. The British government under Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden refused to participate in any intervention that might widen the conflict and complicate the Geneva negotiations that both governments saw as the appropriate mechanism for resolving the Indochina situation. Without British participation, Eisenhower declined to authorize American military action. The garrison at Dien Bien Phu would have to fight without the external intervention that might have saved it. The decision reflected reasonable strategic calculations on all sides, but for the 13,000 soldiers in the valley, it was a death sentence that American and British decision-makers delivered from comfortable offices while acknowledging their own comfort. The final weeks of the battle produced fighting of extraordinary intensity and equally extraordinary human suffering. Viet Minh troops pushed through the French outer positions one by one, the strongpoints changing hands repeatedly in fighting that destroyed them as military positions, even as both sides continued to contest them. Wounded soldiers accumulated in the field hospital below the valley floor faster than medical staff could treat them. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medicine were running critically low as the deteriorating airstrip made supply drops increasingly ineffective. French paratroopers volunteered to jump into the surrounded garrison, knowing they would not be able to leave, an act of professional solidarity that said something important about the culture of the French military, even as it could do nothing to change the battle's outcome. The garrison surrendered on May 7, 1954, after 56 days of siege that had cost both sides enormous casualties. French and Allied losses included approximately 3,000 killed and 8,000 wounded before the surrender, with the remainder of the garrison taken prisoner. Viet Minh casualties were substantially higher, estimates ranging from 8,000 to 20,000 killed, reflecting the cost of the human wave assaults that Giap had been willing to accept because he understood that the political consequences of victory justified whatever military price was necessary to achieve it. The prisoners taken at Dien Bien Phu faced a brutal march to prisoner of war camps in the Viet Minh-controlled northeast, a journey that killed significant numbers of men already weakened by weeks of combat and inadequate nutrition. The fall of Dien Bien Phu reached Paris on the morning of May 8, 1954, the day after the surrender, and the reaction combined shock with a recognition that many French politicians and military officers had been suppressing for months. The war could not be won. The human and financial cost of continuing had exceeded what French society was willing to pay for an objective that a growing majority of French citizens had concluded was not worth the price. The colonial mission that had justified French presence in Indochina for nearly a century had been exposed at Dien Bien Phu as something that 13,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of Vietnamese dead could not sustain against a population determined to govern itself. The Geneva Conference that was already underway when the garrison surrendered accelerated its work on the Indochina question with the urgency that the changed military reality demanded. The negotiations involved France, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Associated States of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and the major powers including the United States, Britain, China, and the Soviet Union in a complex diplomatic process that reflected the multiple intersecting interests of the Cold War international system as much as the specific aspirations of the Vietnamese people whose future was being decided. The Geneva Accords signed in July 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam governing the north and the French-backed state of Vietnam governing the south, pending nationwide elections scheduled for 1956 that were supposed to reunify the country under a single government chosen by the Vietnamese people. The accords provided for the withdrawal of French forces and the regroupment of Viet Minh forces to the north, creating a de facto partition that both sides understood as temporary, but that the subsequent refusal of the Southern government and its American backers to hold the scheduled elections transformed into something far more durable and far more consequential. The Geneva Accords of July 1954 were signed by men who understood them differently and intended them differently, a fundamental ambiguity that guaranteed they would not hold. The French saw them as an honorable exit from an unwinnable war. The Viet Minh saw them as a temporary arrangement on the path to complete national reunification. The Americans, who refused to sign the final declaration, but issued a unilateral statement promising not to disturb the settlement by force, saw them as a framework for preventing communist consolidation of all Vietnam. The southern Vietnamese government of Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem refused to sign anything at all. For parties, for interpretations, one agreement. The conditions for the next war were written into the document that was supposed to end the first one. The 2 years following the Geneva Accords saw the systematic construction of two very different Vietnamese states on either side of the 17th parallel. In the north, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam consolidated its authority with a combination of genuine popular support earned through years of resistance and the coercive apparatus of a Leninist party state that tolerated neither political opposition nor ideological deviation. Land reform campaigns redistributed agricultural land from landlords to peasants with a violence and an arbitrariness that killed thousands of people in processes whose revolutionary justice was indistinguishable from revolutionary terror. The party acknowledged the excesses and attempted corrections, but the damage to the moral authority that the resistance movement had built was real and lasting. The North was building socialism with the instruments of a one-party state whose commitment to its people's welfare was genuine, but whose methods were brutal in ways that the revolution's idealism did not fully justify. In the South, Ngo Dinh Diem was building a different kind of state, one whose institutional foundations were weaker, whose popular legitimacy was more contested, and whose survival depended from the beginning on American support in quantities that made genuine independence impossible regardless of the formal sovereignty that the Geneva settlement had established. Diem was a Catholic Mandarin in a predominantly Buddhist country, an anti-communist nationalist who had refused to collaborate with either the French or the Japanese during the occupation years and who brought to his leadership a personal integrity and a political rigidity that were inseparable from each other. He was genuinely committed to Vietnamese independence and genuinely contemptuous of the communist movement that had led the resistance against colonialism, a combination that satisfied American strategic requirements while simultaneously limiting his ability to build the broad popular coalition that governing a divided country under constant external pressure required. The scheduled 1956 elections that the Geneva Accords had specified as the mechanism for Vietnamese reunification were never held. Diem refused to participate, citing the impossibility of free elections in the Communist North. a characterization that was accurate about northern political conditions, while conveniently ignoring the question of whether elections in the South would produce a result favorable to his continued rule. American policymakers supported Diem's refusal, calculating that Ho Chi Minh's personal popularity across both halves of Vietnam made a nationwide election almost certain to produce a Viet Minh victory that American Cold War strategy could not accept. The decision not to hold the elections was strategically understandable from the American perspective and politically fatal from the perspective of building a southern Vietnamese state with genuine legitimacy, because it confirmed the Viet Minh's narrative that the Geneva settlement was being violated by the South and its American patrons. The human consequences of the partition extended far beyond the political calculations of governments. Approximately 900,000 people, mostly Catholics who feared persecution under communist rule, moved from north to south in the months following Geneva. Around 100,000 Viet Minh fighters and political cadres moved from south to north in accordance with the regroupment provisions of the Accords. The southward migration created a refugee population whose resettlement Diem managed with American assistance in ways that also served his political purposes, creating communities of northern Catholics whose anti-communism was fierce and whose loyalty to Diem was reliable in ways that the broader southern population's allegiance was not. The northward movement of Viet Minh cadres left behind a network of political sleeper agents and hidden weapons caches that would become the organizational foundation of the southern insurgency when Hanoi eventually decided the time had come to resume armed struggle. The decision in Hanoi to authorize the resumption of armed struggle in the South was not made immediately after the partition. The years between 1954 and 1959 were a period of genuine internal debate within the Vietnamese Communist Party about the appropriate strategy for achieving reunification under conditions where the Geneva settlement had temporarily frozen the military situation. The northern leadership was focused on building the socialist state and consolidating the party's authority in territories it actually controlled. And there was genuine reluctance to risk the institutional gains of the North in a renewed military confrontation with what American backing was steadily transforming into a more formidable Southern military opponent. Ho Chi Minh and the party leadership repeatedly counseled patience to the Southern cadres who were experiencing Diem's increasingly brutal suppression campaigns and demanding authorization to respond with force. The suppression campaigns that Diem launched against former Viet Minh members and sympathizers in the South through the mid-1950s were driven by a genuine security concern about the organizational infrastructure that the Viet Minh had left behind and by a political determination to destroy the communist movement in the South before it could reconstitute itself as a military threat. The Denounce the Communists campaign, beginning in 1955, used a combination of propaganda, social pressure, and direct violence to identify and neutralize Viet Minh networks, killing thousands and imprisoning tens of thousands more in conditions that were brutal enough to generate the resentment and the radicalization that produced new recruits for the movement faster than the suppression campaigns could eliminate existing ones. The Southern cadres who were experiencing this suppression sent increasingly urgent messages to Hanoi requesting authorization to fight back. The party's 15th plenum in January 1959 finally responded to these pressures, authorizing the resumption of armed struggle in the South as a complement to the continued political struggle that the party's doctrine had previously privileged. The decision reflected both the genuine desperation of the Southern movement under Diem's suppression and a strategic calculation that the political situation in the South was sufficiently unstable that armed pressure would accelerate the collapse of Diem's government rather than provoking the American military intervention that more cautious voices in Hanoi feared. Group 559 was established in May 1959 to begin the construction of the supply route that would eventually become known to American military planners as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail was not a single road, but a network of paths. tracks, and supply points that ran through the mountain jungles of Laos and Cambodia parallel to the Vietnamese border, allowing the North to move men and supplies to the south without crossing the demilitarized zone that the Geneva Settlement had established at the 17th parallel. Its construction was an engineering achievement comparable to the logistics operation that had supplied Dien Bien Phu, requiring the labor of thousands of soldiers and civilians working under conditions of constant danger from both the physical environment and the aerial observation that American intelligence was beginning to direct toward the border regions. The National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, established in December 1960 as the organizational vehicle for the Southern insurgency, represented the political face of a movement that American officials consistently described as a Northern creation, and that its own participants consistently described as a Southern uprising. The truth was more complex than either characterization allowed. The front's founding reflected genuine Southern grievances against Diem's government, and many of its members and supporters were motivated primarily by opposition to Diem rather than by communist ideology. But its organizational structure was shaped by the Vietnamese Communist Party. Its military arm received direction and eventually reinforcement from the North, and its strategic objectives were consistent with the reunification goals that Hanoi had never abandoned. The American characterization of it as purely a Northern instrument ignored the genuine Southern dimensions of its appeal. The front's own characterization of itself as purely a Southern organization ignored the Northern direction that shaped its strategy. Diem's government was simultaneously fighting the insurgency and alienating the population whose support was essential to defeating it. His strategic Hamlet program, launched in 1962 with American advice and American resources, attempted to concentrate rural Vietnamese into fortified villages that could be defended against insurgent penetration and that would separate the population from the National Liberation Front's political infrastructure. The concept reflected a genuine insight about the relationship between population and insurgency, drawing on the British experience in Malaya, where a similar approach had contributed to defeating the communist insurgency there. The implementation in Vietnam reflected none of the conditions that had made the Malayan approach effective, forcing peasants from ancestral lands into unfamiliar locations, generating resentment that drove them toward rather than away from the front, and creating fortified positions that often lacked the military capacity to defend themselves against determined attack. The Buddhist crisis of 1963 brought the contradictions of the Diem government into full international view. Diem's brother Ngo Dinh Nhu and his wife, whose influence over the government had grown to levels that many American officials found deeply troubling, responded to Buddhist protests against religious discrimination with a series of crackdowns that included the raiding of Buddhist pagodas by security forces in August 1963. The image of a Catholic government attacking Buddhist religious sites in a predominantly Buddhist country generated the kind of international coverage that made continued American support for Diem politically unsustainable in ways that the Kennedy administration recognized even as it struggled to identify an acceptable alternative. The coup that overthrew and killed Diem on November 1, 1963, was carried out by South Vietnamese military officers who had concluded that Diem's continued rule was incompatible with the effective prosecution of the war against the insurgency. American officials were aware that a coup was being planned and declined to intervene to prevent it, a decision that amounted to a green light regardless of the subsequent American insistence that Washington had not authorized the specific action. Diem's murder, carried out in the back of an armored personnel carrier after his capture following the coup, shocked Kennedy, who had not anticipated that the generals would kill rather than exile him, and who understood that American complicity in the assassination of a government it had created would carry moral and political costs that the subsequent course of the war would multiply. Kennedy himself was assassinated 3 weeks later in Dallas, leaving to Lyndon Johnson the impossible inheritance of a deteriorating war in a country whose political foundations were crumbling faster than American assistance could shore them up. The series of military governments that succeeded Diem through 1964 and into 1965 demonstrated the absence of the political foundation that effective counterinsurgency required, each new government generating the kind of instability that gave the National Liberation Front political space that military operations alone could not close. The lessons that the First Indochina War should have taught about the limits of external military power in the face of determined nationalist resistance were available to any American policymaker willing to study them honestly. The French had entered their war with overwhelming military advantages in equipment, training, and firepower. They had received increasing American financial support through the war's final years. They had fought with genuine professional skill and genuine personal courage in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty. And they had lost, not because they were outfought in any narrow military sense, but because they were fighting for objectives that the Vietnamese people were not willing to accept at any price that France was willing to pay. The Viet Minh had won not simply by fighting, but by sustaining the political will to fight longer than their opponents could sustain the political will to continue. Giap's strategy had always been more political than military in its fundamental logic, aimed at eroding the French public's tolerance for a war whose costs were visible and whose benefits were increasingly difficult to articulate. The strategy had worked with a completeness that the military outcome at Dien Bien Phu dramatized, but did not by itself produce. The battle was the conclusion of a political process that had been running for 8 years, not the cause of the French decision to negotiate. The Geneva settlement that ended the First Indochina War did not resolve the underlying questions about Vietnamese self-determination and reunification that the war had been fought over. It suspended them behind a temporary partition that all parties understood as provisional and that no party was genuinely committed to making permanent. The Americans who inherited the French position in the South after 1954 accepted an analytical framework about the nature of the Vietnamese conflict that the French experience directly contradicted, insisting that military means could achieve political objectives that military means had just conclusively demonstrated were beyond their reach. The human cost of the First Indochina War demands acknowledgement that the geopolitical narrative of Cold War strategy and colonial resistance can obscure. French military dead numbered approximately 90,000, including soldiers from the Metropolitan Army, the Foreign Legion, and the colonial forces from North Africa and elsewhere. Vietnamese dead on both sides of the conflict numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with civilian casualties impossible to estimate with precision, but certainly exceeding military losses by substantial margins. The villages destroyed, the families displaced, the agricultural land abandoned, and the economic infrastructure damaged represented costs that fell most heavily on the Vietnamese people who had the least influence over the decisions that produced them. The soldiers who fought at Dien Bien Phu on both sides carried the physical and psychological consequences of the battle for the rest of their lives. The French prisoners who survived the march to the Viet Minh prison camps and the months of captivity that followed returned to France changed in ways that their families and their society found difficult to fully understand or accommodate. The Vietnamese fighters who had carried artillery pieces through mountain jungles and charged across open ground against French defensive fire bore wounds that the victory could not heal and that the subsequent decades of continued conflict would compound rather than resolve. The First Indochina War ended on July 21, 1954, with the signing of the Geneva Accords. It ended without resolving the questions it had been fought over. It ended with a partition that planted the seeds of the next conflict. It ended with an American commitment to the South that would grow over the following decade into the largest military intervention in American history. It ended with a lesson about the relationship between military power and political legitimacy that the next generation of decision-makers in Washington would choose not to learn. The guns fell silent along the 17th parallel, and in the silence, the machinery of the next war was already turning. The legacy of the First Indochina War extends across the decades that followed with a reach that no post-war settlement could contain. It demonstrated that colonial authority could not survive the combination of genuine nationalist resistance and the changed moral climate of the post-war international order. It established the military and political methods that People's War could deploy against technologically superior opponents. It revealed the gap between the military capacity to hold territory and the political capacity to govern it with sufficient legitimacy to sustain the popular support that effective governance required. These were lessons written in the lives of hundreds of thousands of human beings across 8 years of continuous conflict, lessons whose clarity and whose cost should have made them impossible to ignore. The Valley of Dien Bien Phu is a tourist destination today. Visitors walk among the preserved French bunkers and the monuments to the Vietnamese victory. The surrounding hills where Giap's artillery once overlooked the valley are covered with the same jungle that concealed the guns in 1954, the airstrip where French supply aircraft once landed under anti-aircraft fire is gone. The strong points whose names the French soldiers fought and died for have returned to the red earth from which they were built. What remains is the memory of what happened there and the understanding of what it meant for the French soldiers who fought without a cause worth their sacrifice, for the Vietnamese fighters who fought with a cause whose ultimate cost they could not yet fully reckon, and for the Americans who watched from a distance and decided, against all available evidence, that the outcome would be different if they tried.